Well, good afternoon. Does anyone find Jesus annoying sometimes? I mean, if you remember, when Jesus gets asked a question, a lot of times he won't give a direct answer. He'll answer a question with a question. And you feel like saying, come on, Jesus, just tell us. Or he'll tell a parable, which sometimes is rather obscure. So we don't almost get a clear message from Jesus. One of my students once said to me, why does Jesus have to be so cryptic? But this morning, Jesus answers very directly. There is no pause. There is no doubt. He answers very clearly. Which commandment is the greatest? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law of the prophets depend on these two commandments. Jesus combines two of the great laws of the Old Testament and puts them together, loving God and love of neighbor. John will later tell us, whoever says he loves God but hates his neighbor is a liar. Well, even though Jesus is quite direct in telling us what we need to do this morning, we have another question. We're told to love God and neighbor, but how do we love God? And how do we love our neighbor? I think one of the problems with loving is that oftentimes we think in too big of terms. We think that every act of love we do has to be an act which will transform the world. I used to have this confessor that I found a little bit frustrating because when it came time to give me my penance, he wouldn't give me 5 Our Fathers or 3 Hail Marys or something like that. He would say, I want you to do a loving action and then pray for that person. Well, then I spent the rest of the week trying to figure out if what I did was good enough to qualify for the penance. Was it good enough just to help someone across the street or to help someone out of a car? Or did it have to be bigger than that? What exactly was the act of love that would satisfy this penance? Or sometimes we think of love as being much greater than ourselves, bigger than life. The founder of the Paulist, and Father Ernie can tell you more about this, Isaac Hecker, he had an experience when he was young in which he said he felt an angelic presence by him. And he went on to say that this was pure being, but he described the pure being as pure love and pure joy. I think we all strive to encounter that pure love and pure joy. I had another friend who told me about his father, who was an alcoholic. He said his father one day was praying very intensely, and as he was praying, he felt next to him an angelic presence which he defined as pure love. And from that moment, he changed his life. I have never experienced pure love, but I have had intimations of it. A number of years ago, I worked with a Vietnamese woman whose daughter, a 34-year-old woman, who was dying from inoperable stomach cancer. And this woman was taking care of her daughter in the hospital. This woman had had an extraordinarily difficult life. In 1954, she had to flee the communists from North Vietnam and go to South Vietnam. Then she'd lived through 30 years of civil war. When the war came to an end, she again found herself in a very oppressed situation. So she and her family went out on a makeshift boat and just floated out into the sea and waited for a ship to pick them up. They were finally saved, and she came to the United States and established a new life here. But here then she was confronted with watching her daughter die from this cancer. And what impressed me was the extraordinary love and care she took in taking care of her daughter. I watched her in the hospital daily, taking care of her daughter's needs. After her daughter ate, she would take her hand and she would wash the hands. She would wash them finger by finger. It was one of the most sacramental acts I've ever witnessed. And then again, in another situation, I saw a man who'd been married for more than 60 years. He was 89 years old. He was dying as well in the hospital. His wife was going to come and be with him. And so as he was waiting for her to arrive, he was becoming more nervous and agitated. And finally, they rolled her in on a wheelchair. And she came together with him, and they simply held hands. And at that moment, you saw an extraordinary example of love. It was a love that had existed. They had borne 60 years of married life. They'd raised 5 children, buried 1 child. They had suffered and enjoyed all of the struggles and difficulties of married life. But in that moment, you could see this incredible love between them. It was one of the most intimate moments I'd ever been at. So intimate, in fact, that I excused myself to let them be alone. I've also seen intimations of this pure love in my own married life. I've never experienced pure love, but I have had intimations of that love. What we learn is that loving God and loving neighbor means doing the simple, everyday actions of loving one another. We do not know where our lives are going to lead us, but we know that we can respond to those incidents with love. In the first reading today, Exodus gives us some pretty direct, clear directions. Do not oppress the alien. Do not wrong a widow or an orphan. Do not wrong the poor. Quite simply, we are to love the outcast, those on the periphery, those who were unloved. The great apostle of love, Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic worker movement, put it this way: we love God as much as we love the least. And she develops a simple philosophy of love. She says, the way to become more loving, of loving God and of loving neighbor, is simply to love. The more we love, the more loving we become. And the more we love, the presence of God, who is love, becomes present in our world. She said, love is basically an act of the will. She was very fond of quoting St. John of the Cross, who said, where there is no love, put love, and you will draw out love. But more than that, she talked about the daily struggle of daily life at the Catholic Worker House. We had all sorts of poor, homeless, people with mental challenges coming there. It was a very difficult scene. And sometimes, she said, she became overwhelmed with what she encountered. But this is what she writes. She says, at times the burden gets too heavy. There are too many of them. My love is too small. I even feel with terror I have no love in my heart. I have nothing to give them, and yet I have to pretend that I have. But strange and wonderful, the make-believe becomes true. If you will to love someone, you soon do. You will to love this cranky old man, and someday you do. It depends on how hard you try. We love by loving. We love by doing the simple but difficult acts of love presented to us each day. No act is too small. We love by loving. The sacrifice of love that we are called to may be difficult, but if we are to be followers of Jesus, we must follow him and do that love. What is the greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law of the prophets depend on these laws and commandments. Amen.